Imagine, this is 1967 and Mexico is in full swing. The economy is growing, the middle classes are emerging in Mexico City, and a car starts appearing that will change forever how Mexicans get around. It's not luxurious, it's not fast, it doesn't have the aerodynamic lines of the American muscle cars that dominate the magazines, but it has something more powerful. It's affordable. It's the Volkswagen Sedan, though here no one will call it that for long. Soon it'll just be the Bocho, and it'll become the most iconic car Mexico has ever known. Now, I know what you're thinking. We're talking about a German design from the 1930s, a car whose origin is stained by Nazi ideology, commissioned by Ferdinand Porsche under Adolf Hitler's orders. And yet, this same vehicle transformed in Mexico into a symbol of democracy on wheels, of popular mobility, of hope. How is it possible that a car with such a dark past became the inseparable companion of millions of Mexican families? The 1960s and 1970s were transformative decades for Mexico. The country was experiencing the so-called Mexican miracle, a period of sustained economic growth. Mexico City was expanding into the state of Mexico, new neighborhoods were being born, and the working class was starting to dream of something that seemed impossible before, owning their own car. The Volkswagen Sedan arrived right at that crucial moment, not as a luxury product, but as a tangible promise of progress. The fascinating part of this story is how such a simple car, so devoid of pretensions, managed to capture the heart of an entire nation. The Bocho wasn't just transportation, it was a cultural phenomenon, an icon in Mexican cinema, the quintessential taxi, the first car for entire generations. And the most extraordinary thing, Mexico was the last country in the world to manufacture it, keeping it alive until 2003, decades after it disappeared in Europe. But there are aspects of its history that even the most nostalgic don't know. Secrets of its manufacturing, surprising data about its economic impact, human stories intertwined with every unit that came out of the Puebla plant. So, join me to discover 20 shocking facts about the Volkswagen Sedan in Mexico. Facts that reveal why this car transcends mere nostalgia and becomes a fundamental chapter in our history as a country. Fact 1. The Bocho was born from a pact with the devil, literally. The Volkswagen Sedan didn't come from a conventional design table. Its origin is in 1934, when Adolf Hitler commissioned Ferdinand Porsche to create the people's car, the Kraft durch Freudewagen. The idea was simple, but loaded with propaganda. A vehicle so economical that any German worker could buy it through a savings plan. It was mobility as a tool for social control, a carrot to keep the population happy while the regime prepared for war. Porsche designed a revolutionary car for its time, rear-engine air-cooled, independent suspension, rounded shapes to reduce wind resistance. But here's the dark detail that few know. The Wolfsburg factory, where it would be built, was constructed with forced labor. Thousands of enslaved workers from concentration camps built those facilities. During the war, the plant didn't produce civilian cars, but military vehicles, the Kubelwagen and the Schwimmwagen, both used by the Wehrmacht on the front. When the war ended in 1945, the factory was in ruins, bombed by the Allies. The British, who controlled that area of Germany, briefly considered dismantling it as war reparations. But a British officer, Major Ivan Hurst, saw potential in that strange design. He ordered the factory to be repaired and production restarted. The first post-war Volkswagen came off the line in December 1945, painted in the characteristic British Army green. That's how the redemption of a car, born under the worst imaginable circumstances, began. The ironic thing is that Hitler's people's car never reached the German workers during the Nazi regime. It was the Mexicans, decades later, who really turned it into the vehicle of the masses, fulfilling the original promise but stripping it of all its ideological baggage. The Bocho in Mexico didn't represent authoritarianism. It represented exactly the opposite: freedom of movement, independence, opportunity. Fact 2. Mexico wasn't the first country to manufacture it, but it was the one that loved it the most deeply. The story of the Bocho in Mexico begins in 1954, when the first imported examples arrived in the country. They were curiosities, strange cars with the engine in the back, that challenged all American automotive logic. But some visionaries saw their potential. In 1964, Volkswagen de Mexico inaugurated its plant in Puebla, and everything changed. The decision to establish production in Mexico wasn't accidental. The Mexican government, under President Adolfo López Mateos, had implemented decrees that required foreign automakers to manufacture a growing percentage of components locally. Volkswagen saw in Mexico not just an emerging market, but a platform for all of Latin America. The Puebla plant started assembling vehicles with imported parts, but quickly developed local suppliers. The first completely assembled sedan in Mexico came off the line on October 23, 1964. There was no big ceremony. It was just another car in a market dominated by Ford, Chevrolet, and Dodge. But Volkswagen understood something that its competitors underestimated: the power of an affordable price combined with proven reliability. While American cars offered chrome, power, and size, the Bocho offered something more valuable to the average Mexican: the certainty that you could afford it and maintain it. Fact 3. The original price was incredibly low, and yet it still represented a dream. When the sedan started selling in Mexico in the mid-1960s, its price was around 17,000 Mexican pesos. To put it in perspective, the average salary of a skilled worker was about 800 pesos a month. Yes, the car cost more than 20 months' salary, but here's the trick. Volkswagen introduced accessible financing schemes that allowed reasonable monthly payments. Compare that to a Ford Falcon or Chevrolet Impala of the time, which cost double or more and required premium gasoline, expensive imported parts, and specialized mechanics. The Bocho used regular gasoline, its parts were cheap and plentiful, and any neighborhood mechanic could repair it with basic tools. The real cost of ownership was a fraction of its competitors. By 1970, with the Mexican economy booming, the Bocho had become the aspirational car of the emerging middle class. Teachers, government employees, small business owners, all dreamed of the moment they could park their own sedan in front of their house. It wasn't just a car, it was physical proof that you were progressing, that you belonged to that new Mexican middle class that was building the country. Fact 4. The engine was tiny, but practically indestructible. Under the rear lid of the Bocho lived a 4-cylinder boxer engine, air-cooled. In its early Mexican versions, it displaced 1,200 cubic centimeters and produced just 40 horsepower. 40. In modern terms, that's what a mid-size motorcycle generates. And yet, this little engine moved the car, its load, its family, and did it day after day, year after year, without giving up. The genius of Porsche's design wasn't in the power, but in the radical simplicity. Being air-cooled, it eliminated the radiator, water pump, hoses, all the liquid cooling system that caused so many headaches in other cars. In the stifling heat of Mexicali or the altitude of Mexico City, the Bocho just worked. It didn't overheat, it didn't lose coolant, it just needed fresh oil every 3,000 kilometers and an occasional valve adjustment. Over the years, Volkswagen increased the displacement. In 1970 came the 1,500 cubic centimeter engine with 44 horsepower. In 1992, the last major change, 1,600 cubic centimeters and 50 horsepower. It was still ridiculously underpowered by modern standards, but enough. And here's the extraordinary thing. There are Bochos with original engines that have covered more than 500,000 kilometers with basic maintenance. These engines simply didn't die. Fact 5. The top speed was modest, but no one seemed to care. Volkswagen claimed the sedan could reach 115 kilometers per hour at top speed. The reality, according to countless road tests and the experience of millions of owners, was closer to 105 or 110 kilometers per hour. And that with the accelerator floored, the engine howling at full volume, and a good dose of faith. But here's the point. No one cared. The Bocho wasn't designed for racing on the Mexico-Querétaro highway. It was designed to navigate urban traffic, to climb the hills of Mexico City with its 4-speed transmission, to park in impossible spaces thanks to its light steering and compact dimensions. What did matter was fuel consumption, and there the Bocho shone. With prudent driving, you could easily get 15 or 16 kilometers per liter. In city traffic, it dropped to 12 or 13, but it was still exceptional. During the oil crises of the 1970s, when gasoline prices skyrocketed globally, The Bocho proved its real value. While owners of American V8 cars cried at the gas stations, Bocho owners smiled discreetly while filling their 40-liter tanks that would last them the whole week. Fact 6. More than 1.7 million were manufactured in Mexico, a figure that reveals its absolute dominance. Between 1964 and 2003, the Puebla plant produced exactly 1,721,117 Volkswagen Sedans. To appreciate this number, consider that at the peak of its production, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, more than 100,000 Bochos came off the line each year. The plant operated in multiple shifts, employed tens of thousands of workers, and had become one of the industrial pillars of Puebla. But here's the truly impressive fact. Mexico not only manufactured more Bochos than any other country except Germany, but continued making them decades after the model was discontinued elsewhere in the world. In Germany, the last sedan came off the line in 1978. In Brazil, production stopped in 1986. By 2000, only Mexico kept production alive. Why? Because the Mexican market still demanded them. Taxi drivers preferred them for their low operating costs. Young families bought them as their first car. Mechanics knew how to repair them blindfolded. There was a whole economy built around the Bocho: parts manufacturers, specialized workshops, upholsterers, body shops. It was a complete ecosystem. Fact 7. The taxi version was an urban legend on wheels. If there's one image that defines the Bocho in the Mexican collective imagination, it's the green and white taxi, later just green, that dominated the streets of Mexico City for decades. At its peak, in the late 1980s, more than 60% of the capital's taxis were Volkswagen Sedans. 60%. It was practically impossible to walk a block without seeing one. Taxi drivers loved the Bocho for purely pragmatic reasons. It consumed little gasoline, essential when you spent 12 hours a day driving. Parts were cheap and plentiful. Any shop could repair it quickly without charging a fortune. And most importantly, it was reliable. A taxi driver can't afford for their work tool to break down constantly. The Bocho rarely betrayed them. But there was a dark side to this love story. The Bocho taxis also became the scene of countless assaults and crimes. The lack of separation between driver and passengers, the reduced space, the ease of locking the doors from inside, all this made them vulnerable. By the early 2000s, the Mexico City government decided it was time to retire them, arguing safety and polluting emissions. The last day the green Bochos could legally work as taxis in Mexico City was September 30th, 2012. It was a nostalgic day. The media covered the last runs. Veteran taxi drivers, some with tears in their eyes, spoke of entire decades making a living behind the wheel of these cars. It was the end of an era. The capital's streets would never be the same without that sea of curved green roofs. Fact 8. The Bocho had a starring role in Mexican cinema. From the 1960s well into the 21st century, the Bocho appeared in countless Mexican movies, not as simple background vehicles, but as characters in their own right. It was the car of the friendly neighbor, the humble suitor who conquered the posh girl, the philosophical taxi driver, the university student. It represented authenticity, simplicity, closeness to the people. The movie that perhaps best captured the essence of the Bocho was Un Mundo Maravilloso by Luis Estrada, where the protagonist drives a beat-up sedan that's both his transportation and a metaphor for his life. It endures everything, keeps running against all odds, but has clearly seen better days. That image resonated deeply with millions of Mexicans who saw their own struggles reflected in that dented but tireless car. Even in foreign productions filmed in Mexico, the Bocho appeared inevitably because it was impossible to capture the essence of Mexican streets without including it. It was part of the urban landscape, as much as street vendors or taco stands. Fact 9. They lasted decades with basic care, but corrosion was their mortal enemy. Ask anyone who owned a Bocho, and they'll tell you the same thing. Mechanically, these cars were practically immortal. The engine, transmission, suspension, everything designed with generous tolerances and quality materials. With regular oil changes and basic preventive maintenance, a Bocho could easily surpass 300,000 kilometers without major repairs. The Achilles heel was rust. Mexico, especially in coastal areas or Mexico City with its aggressive pollution, isn't kind to metal. The bochos, built in an era when anti-corrosion treatment was rudimentary, were vulnerable. The underbody, fenders, rockers, doors, everything could start rotting from the inside out. A bocho that ran perfectly could be doomed by rust holes in the chassis that compromised its structural integrity. Many owners discovered too late that under the seemingly healthy paint was rotted metal. The solution was costly. Cut out the damaged metal, weld in new plates, a whole artisanal process that in specialized shops could cost as much as the value of the entire car. This is why, despite more than 1.7 million units manufactured, bochos in good condition are increasingly rare. They didn't disappear due to mechanical failures. They disappeared devoured by rust, victims of time and the elements. The surviving examples today are typically those that were stored under cover, meticulously maintained, or that spent their years in the dry climates of northern Mexico. Fact 10. The interior was Spartan, but surprisingly functional. Open the door of a bocho, and you're greeted by an interior that can only be described as extreme minimalist. A simple dashboard with speedometer, fuel gauge, and little else. Seats upholstered in vinyl that burned your legs in summer and froze your back in winter. Windows that opened with cranks. No air conditioning in the standard versions. No power steering, no power windows, and yet it worked. The interior space, despite the compact exterior size, was surprisingly usable for 4 adults. The driving position was upright, giving you good visibility. The controls fell naturally to hand. The gear shift, though with long throws, was precise. The steering wheel, large and thin, offered direct feel with the road. The more equipped versions, especially toward the end of production, incorporated some modern comforts, radio with cassette, later with CD, cloth upholstery instead of vinyl, even some special models with optional air conditioning. But the essence remained, functional simplicity over superficial luxury. This austerity wasn't a flaw, it was intentional design. Every element of the interior served its function without unnecessary frills. There was no wasted space, no electronic complications that could fail. It was an honest cabin for an honest car, and for millions of Mexicans, that basic interior was the setting for fundamental moments. The first kiss in the back seat, family trips to the provinces, the excitement of driving your own car for the first time. Fact 11. Current values reflect nostalgia and growing scarcity. In the Mexican classic car market, bochos occupy a peculiar space. They're not extremely expensive like a classic Mustang or Corvette, but they're not the bargains they were a decade ago. A sedan in decent condition, running well but with cosmetic details to attend to, can cost between 50,000 and 80,000 pesos. A restored example with perfect paint, new interior, and renewed mechanics can easily reach 150,000 to 200,000 pesos. The most sought-after models are the last years of production, especially the 2003 Ultima Edición ones, of which only 3,000 units were made in beige. These can exceed 250,000 pesos in museum condition. Also valuable are the ones from the late 1960s and early 1970s, the so-called small windows for their rarity and aesthetics more faithful to the original German design. What's interesting is that the market keeps growing. Every year there are fewer salvageable bochos in circulation, devoured by rust and wear. At the same time, the generation that grew up with these cars is reaching an age where they have resources to revive the nostalgia. This combination of growing scarcity and sustained demand is constantly pushing prices up. Fact 12. They inspired a whole culture of customization and modification. The bocho wasn't just a car you bought and drove. It was a blank canvas that invited personal expression. From the 1970s, owners started customizing their sedans in creative ways. Some were subtle, a set of sport rims, a decal, sport seats. Others were radical, lowered bochos with hydraulic suspensions, metallic paint with flames, interiors completely reupholstered in velvet. A whole accessory industry emerged. You could buy rear spoilers, front fascias in Porsche style, chrome exhaust pipes, sport steering wheels. Sound systems worth more than the car itself. Body shops specialized in extreme transformations. Some stretched the chassis to create bocho limousines. Others turned them into pickups by cutting off the rear. Some even installed Porsche engines or turbo setups that multiplied the power. This modification culture was democratic. You didn't need to be rich to customize your bocho. With ingenuity and manual labor, anyone could transform their car into something unique. It was common to see bochos with homemade details, handcrafted wood moldings, upholstery sewn by the owner themselves, paint applied with a homemade compressor. The result wasn't always elegant, but it was always authentic. Fact 13. They were protagonists in records and unexpected feats. Bochos participated in races, rallies, and endurance tests that demonstrated their robustness beyond all expectation. In the Pan American race, the legendary endurance competition that runs Mexico from south to north, modified bochos have competed in historic categories, enduring the punishment of thousands of kilometers at racing speeds. There are documented stories of bochos that cross the entire continent from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, with nothing more than basic maintenance along the way. Others have been driven around the world, accumulating hundreds of thousands of kilometers in all imaginable terrains and climates. These cars proved time and again that their simple design was also extraordinarily robust. One of the most notable records involves a Mexico City bocho taxi that, according to its owner, exceeded 1,200,000 kilometers with the original engine. Though impossible to verify completely, the story became legendary among taxi drivers, a kind of foundational myth that reinforced faith in the sedan's indestructibility. Fact 14. The last manufactured bocho was a national event loaded with emotion. On July 30, 2003, the Puebla plant stopped its sedan production lines forever. The last example, an Ultima Edición sedan in beige with serial number 215299464, came off the line amid a ceremony loaded with symbolism. Veteran workers, some with decades of experience assembling bochos, watched with tears in their eyes. It was the end of an era of 70 years of continuous production of the same basic design. The reasons for discontinuing the model were multiple and inevitable. Emission standards had become increasingly strict, and the bocho's air-cooled engine couldn't meet them without modifications that would make it prohibitively expensive. Modern safety standards required airbags, ABS brakes, programmed crumple zones, all incompatible with the 1938 design. And finally, the market had changed. Young buyers wanted modern cars with air conditioning, power steering, technology. Volkswagen tried to keep the spirit alive with models like the new Beetle, but it was never the same. The new Beetle was retro-conscious, a nostalgic evocation of the original. The bocho simply was what it was, without pretensions, without irony. That last sedan was sent directly to the Volkswagen Museum in Wolfsburg, Germany, completing a poetic circle. The German-born car, perfected in Mexico, returned home for its final retirement. Fact 15. They represent a lost philosophy of automaking. Perhaps the most important thing about the Volkswagen Sedan isn't its technical specs or production figures, but what it represented philosophically. It was a car designed under the premise that motorized transportation should be accessible, reliable, repairable, and sufficient. You didn't need excessive power, you didn't need unnecessary luxury, you didn't need electronic complications. You needed something that worked day after day, year after year, without bankrupting you. In our modern era of SUVs that weigh 2 tons and consume 20 liters every 100 kilometers, of cars loaded with touchscreens and systems that require software updates, the bocho reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Most of our real transportation needs could be met with much less than what we consume. The bocho carried 4 people, climbed mountains, traversed the country, and did it with 800 kilograms of weight and 40 liters of fuel that lasted 500 kilometers. It was enough, and enough was paradoxically abundant. Fact 16. The Puebla plant became an emblem of Mexican industrialization. The Volkswagen factory in Puebla wasn't just another assembly plant. At its peak, it was the largest automotive facility in Latin America, directly employing more than 15,000 workers and indirectly generating jobs for another 100,000 in the supply chain. Entire families depended on that plant. Puebla transformed urbanistically around it, with whole neighborhoods inhabited by VW workers and their families. What was extraordinary was the level of vertical integration Volkswagen achieved in Mexico. They didn't just assemble cars with imported parts. They developed a network of national suppliers that made everything from screws to seats, from glass to electrical systems. By the 1980s, the national content of the bocho exceeded 85%. This meant that when you bought a bocho, you were buying a genuinely Mexican product, not just assembled here, but manufactured here. The plant also became a school for industrial training. Thousands of engineers, technicians, and specialized workers learned German quality standards there, advanced manufacturing methodologies, a culture of continuous improvement. Many of them later took that knowledge to other industries, seeding technical expertise throughout the country. The legacy of the Puebla plant goes far beyond the cars it produced. Fact in 17. Electric bochos existed before Tesla was even imaginable. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone. In the 1990s, there was an experimental program to convert bochos to electric propulsion. The National Autonomous University of Mexico, in collaboration with some private companies, developed prototype electric sedans that circulated in a pilot program around Mexico City. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. The bocho, being light and aerodynamic for its time, was an ideal candidate for electric conversion. The combustion engine was removed, a compact electric motor was installed, and the available space was filled with lead-acid batteries. The range was limited, around 80 kilometers per charge, but enough for urban use. Top speed dropped to about 70 kilometers per hour, but in city traffic, that rarely mattered. The project never scaled to mass production for multiple reasons: battery costs, lack of charging infrastructure, and mainly, lack of political will to subsidize the transition. But it proved something important. The bocho's design was so versatile that it could adapt even to technologies that didn't exist when it was conceived. Today, decades later, enthusiasts continue converting bochos to electric as personal projects, giving them new life with 21st century technology. Fact 18. They were exported from Mexico to unexpected places. Although the Puebla plant produced mainly for the domestic market, it also exported bochos to surprising destinations. During the 1970s and 1980s, Mexican-made ones were sent to countries in Central America and the Caribbean, where they became as popular as in their country of origin. Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica all received regular shipments. But here's the truly curious fact. In the 1990s, when Germany no longer produced the sedan, some special and limited edition models were exported from Puebla back to Europe for collectors and nostalgic Germans who wanted to own a last bocho. It was a poetic circle. The German design, manufactured in Mexico with Mexican labor and materials, returned home as a collectible. There were also exports to the United States, though in small volumes, mainly for Mexican immigrant communities feeling homesick. Some border states saw bochos with Mexican plates crossing regularly to work in agricultural fields or the service industry. These cars became mobile symbols of the Mexican diaspora. Fact 19. They generated a whole slang and linguistic culture of their own. The bocho enriched popular Mexican vocabulary in unexpected ways. First, there's the name itself, bocho, a affectionate Mexicanization of Volkswagen that sounded friendly, close, familiar. No one said, "I'm going in my Volkswagen Sedan." They said, "I'm going in my bocho," with the same affectionate tone they'd use for a pet. But there was more terminology. Old bochos, particularly beat-up ones, were chatarra bochos, or simply fieros. Those with exaggerated modifications were tuneados bochos, or pimp bochos. The green taxis were green bochos, or cocodrilos for their color. Each generation had its nickname: small windows, long arms, 1600, each term loaded with meaning for the connoisseurs. It also generated expressions. Traigo mi bocho not only meant you arrived in your car, it meant something more, that you were practical, that you didn't show off, that you were one who valued function over form. That bocho doesn't give up applied to cars as well as people, a metaphor for resilience. The bocho infiltrated Mexican colloquial language in ways no other car achieved. Even common failures had their picturesque names. When the engine made excessive valve noise, mechanics said it cascabeleaba. When the transmission jumped out of second, it patinaba la segunda. When the electrical system failed due to old wires, it was haciendo cortos, a whole popular technical vocabulary built around the mechanical peculiarities of the sedan. Fact 20. Its legacy lives in every corner where there was one. Walk through any working-class neighborhood in any Mexican city, and you'll still see them. Not as many as before, but they're there. Bochos parked in garages, some still in daily use, others waiting for resurrection, some sadly abandoned rusting under tarps. Each one with a story, each one that took a family on vacation, that transported a worker to their job for 20 years. That was someone's first car, the scene of a first kiss, the silent witness to countless moments of ordinary life. The Volkswagen Sedan wasn't the fastest car Mexico knew. It wasn't the most luxurious, it wasn't the most beautiful by conventional standards, but it was, without possible argument, the most significant. It was the car that democratized mobility in this country. It was the car that allowed millions of families to dream of progress and make that dream tangible. It was the car that proved something born under the darkest circumstances can be completely redeemed in the hands of the people who adopt it. Almost 1.5 million Bochos still circulate in Mexico, according to the latest estimates. Fewer every time, it's true. Every year that passes, more succumb to rust, accidents, or the simple decision that it's time to upgrade to something more modern. But as long as even one remains rolling our streets, the spirit of the Bocho lives on. It wasn't just transportation, it was a social pact on wheels. It was the promise that mobility didn't have to be a privilege for the few. It was proof that the simple, the honest, the functional can endure decades while more pretentious designs fall into oblivion. If you had a Bocho, if you learned to drive in one, if your dad took you to school in one, if you took 1,000 green taxis in Mexico City, if you simply grew up seeing them on every corner, then you know I'm not exaggerating. The Bocho wasn't a car, it was part of our collective identity. It was the mechanical soundtrack of several generations of Mexicans. And now that almost all are gone, now that the streets fill with identical SUVs and cars that seem to come from the same globalized mold, perhaps we value more what that deformed, noisy, slow, uncomfortable, wonderful car represented. It represented something we've lost, the idea that less can be enough, that the durable is worth more than the novel, that a well-designed object can serve faithfully for an entire lifetime. The last Bocho came off the line in 2003, but its story didn't end that day. It lives in every example lovingly restored by enthusiasts who understand its value. It lives in the yellowed photographs where it's parked in front of the family home. It lives in the anecdotes we still tell. Remember when the Bocho broke down on the highway and we fixed it with a wire? It lives in the muscle memory of those who still remember exactly how much force it took to put it in reverse. If this journey through 20 facts about the Volkswagen Sedan brought back memories, if you smiled, recognizing your own story in some of these lines, I invite you to share in the comments your experience with the Bocho. Did you have one? What memories do you keep? What anecdote do you have that still makes you laugh or sigh? And if you're from a generation that never knew the Bocho era, I hope these stories have given you a window into a Mexico that no longer exists, but that lives on in the collective memory. A Mexico where the streets sounded different, smelled different, looked different. A Mexico that, for better or worse, will never return. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the history of the most Mexican car that ever existed, even though it came from Germany. If you liked this content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll keep exploring stories that deserve to be told, objects that were more than objects, cultural phenomena that defined who we are. See you in the next video. And if you see a Bocho on the street, honk at it, wave to it, because there are fewer every time, and they deserve that small gesture of recognition for everything they were.